No, this isn't some historical reenactment. This happened in 2021, high up in the Himalayas, where Chinese and Indian troops engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat that looks straight out of the Middle Ages. You can see it right here in this footage. Soldiers from both sides hurling stones, brandishing crude weapons, pushing each other into icy waters. The Chinese troops have modern assault rifles strapped to their backs, but they're not using them. Instead, they're charging uphill while Indian soldiers rain rocks down on their helmets. This isn't just some minor skirmish. This medieval-style warfare has claimed dozens of lives and brought two of Asia's greatest powers to the brink of war. But to understand how we got here, how two countries with space programs and artificial intelligence ended up fighting with sticks and stones, we need to go back, way back. This is the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth, a natural fortress that has separated civilizations for millennia. We're talking about peaks that punch so high into the sky that most commercial airplanes can't even fly over them. These mountains are so massive that they literally shape the weather patterns of all of Asia. The glaciers up here provide water for nearly 2 billion people. And right here, running along these peaks, is one of the most disputed borders in the world. It's called the Line of Actual Control, the LAC, and it stretches for over 2,100 miles between China and India. That's about the same distance as driving from New York to Las Vegas, except this isn't a neat line on a map. It's a maze of competing claims that winds through some of the most extreme terrain on Earth. But here's the thing, neither side can even agree on exactly where this line is. In some places, both armies have different maps showing the border in completely different locations. I'm not talking about small differences. In some areas, their claims are dozens of miles apart. Imagine if you and your neighbor disagreed not just about where your property line was, but about which street your house was on. That's the scale of disagreement we're dealing with here. And it gets even more complicated. See this area right here? China says it's part of Tibet. India says it's part of Ladakh. Both sides have their own patrols, their own maps, their own military posts, all claiming the exact same pieces of land. In some places, you might have Chinese soldiers setting up camp on what their maps show as Chinese territory, while Indian maps show that same spot as being miles inside India. And this disagreement has led to one of the strangest military standoffs in modern history. Let me show you what I mean. This is Ladakh, a high-altitude desert region where much of the fighting took place. The average elevation here is higher than the peak of Mount Whitney, the highest mountain in the contiguous United States. The air is so thin that helicopters can barely fly. The temperature regularly drops below freezing. It's one of the most inhospitable places on Earth, and yet both China and India have sent tens of thousands of troops here to patrol this invisible line. But to understand why these two nations are willing to fight over this seemingly worthless piece of land, we need to understand the history that brought us here. And it starts with the collapse of empires. Let me take you back to 1947. The British Empire is crumbling and they're rushing to leave India after nearly 2 centuries of colonial rule. But their exit strategy? Well, it's a mess. They hastily draw lines on maps, splitting British India into 2 new countries, India and Pakistan. But these weren't just lines on paper, they were dividing communities, families, entire peoples who had lived together for centuries. And right in the middle of this chaos, there's Tibet, this massive plateau that had served as a giant buffer zone between India and China for hundreds of years. Think of it like a cushion between 2 giants. Neither side had to worry much about the other because Tibet was there in between, doing its own thing. But then something huge happens. China, fresh out of its civil war with a new communist government eager to flex its muscles, decides it's time to bring Tibet under its control. In 1950, Chinese troops march in and just like that, the buffer disappears. Suddenly, India and China, 2 massive countries that had never really had to deal with each other directly, are now next-door neighbors. And they need to figure out where exactly their border is, and this is where things get really messy. Look at this map. In the eastern part, right here, India says the border follows this line, the McMahon Line. It's named after a British colonial officer who drew it back in 1914. Seems straightforward, right? Well, China completely rejects it. Their argument? Tibet signed that agreement with British India, but China says Tibet wasn't independent and couldn't make its own treaties. It's like if your neighbor's tenant signed over part of your property. You wouldn't accept that, would you? Then over here in the west, near Ladakh, there's this huge piece of land called Aksai Chin. It's a high-altitude desert, basically a cold, barren wasteland, but both sides want it. Why? Because for China, it's the only way to connect their 2 restive regions, Tibet and Xinjiang. For India, it's historically been part of Ladakh, so you've got two nuclear powers fighting over what's essentially a frozen desert. All this tension finally explodes in 1962. China launches a massive attack. The Indian army, caught completely off guard, suffers a devastating defeat. We're talking about over 1,300 Indian soldiers killed, nearly 4,000 captured, and thousands more wounded. The fighting is so one-sided that after just 1 month, China basically says, "We've made our point," and pulls back. But they keep Aksai Chin. The thing is, for India, this wasn't just a military defeat, it was a national humiliation. Imagine being one of the world's oldest civilizations, just 15 years into independence, and your neighbor comes in and just pushes you around. That kind of thing leaves a mark. Even today, 60 years later, that defeat shapes how India does its military and its relationship with China. After the war, both sides try to find a solution. They come up with something called the line of actual control, basically saying, okay, let's just stick with wherever our troops ended up after the fighting. But here's the problem. They never actually sat down and agreed on where exactly this line was. They each had their own version of where their troops had been. It's like two people trying to split a piece of land by memory without ever drawing an actual line or putting up a fence. I think my troops were here. No, they were over there. And this fuzzy, undefined border has led to dozens of standoffs over the years. Sometimes they're just soldiers yelling at each other, sometimes they're throwing rocks, and sometimes, well, things get a lot more serious. Fast forward to 2020. The world is consumed by news of a strange new virus spreading from China, but high in the Himalayas, something else is brewing. India has been busy building roads, airfields, and military outposts right up to the edge of what they consider their territory. From their perspective, they're just developing their own land. But China sees every new road, every new landing strip as a potential threat. Look at this satellite image. This is the Darbuk Shok Daulat Beg Oldie Road. Try saying that 5 times fast. India spent years building it, snaking through the mountains just a few miles from Chinese positions. For India, it's a vital supply line. For China, it's a military highway that could let Indian troops rush to the border in hours instead of days. In May 2020, China makes its move. Thousands of Chinese troops advance into several areas along the LAC. They're particularly interested in the Galwan Valley, this narrow V-shaped ravine that India considers its territory. Take a look at this terrain. Steep cliffs on both sides, a freezing river at the bottom, and barely enough flat ground to pitch a tent. But its location makes it strategically important. Whoever controls the valley can watch everything moving on that new Indian road. Indian troops respond quickly, and soon you have soldiers from both armies camped just a few hundred meters apart at 14,000 feet. That's higher than any mountain in the continental United States. The air is so thin up here that just walking makes you feel like you've run a marathon. Now, here's where this story takes a bizarre turn. Back in 1996, both countries had signed this agreement. No guns allowed along the border. The thinking was pretty straightforward. If soldiers can't shoot each other, small incidents won't turn into big wars. It seemed logical at the time, but no one imagined what would happen next. This footage. What you're seeing is absolutely extraordinary. Here are Chinese troops moving up this rocky slope. See those Type 95 assault rifles strapped to their backs. They can't use them. Instead, they're carrying primitive weapons. Wooden clubs studded with nails, poles wrapped in barbed wire, rocks gathered from the ground. It's medieval combat in the age of nuclear weapons. The Indian soldiers are up on that ridge and they're not backing down. Watch this. They're literally picking up rocks and hurling them down at the advancing Chinese troops. At one point, you see an Indian soldier get hit by a rock, stagger, but keep fighting. The fighting gets even more intense when the two sides meet. Soldiers grappling hand to hand on narrow mountain paths, wielding improvised weapons like something out of Game of Thrones, but without dragons. Some are being pushed dangerously close to the edge of cliffs. Others are beating each other with sticks and iron rods. There's this particularly dramatic moment where Chinese troops, trying to take a higher position, form these human chains to climb up the slope. Indian soldiers are throwing everything they can find at them. Then suddenly, a group of Indian troops gets surrounded. You can see them being pushed back into the freezing river. The fighting continues into the night. In the darkness, with temperatures dropping below freezing, soldiers are still going at it with their primitive weapons. Some slip on the icy rocks and fall into the Galwan River. Others, disoriented from the thin air and the fighting, stumble off cliffs. By the end of it, 20 Indian soldiers are dead, including a commanding officer. China eventually admits to 4 casualties on their side, though many experts think the real number is higher. But the Galwan Valley clash wasn't the end of it. Over the next year, similar medieval-style battles would break out along other parts of the LAC. In August of 2020, there's another major confrontation at Pangong Lake. The lake is so high up that it freezes completely in winter. Indian troops occupy these strategic heights, bare mountain ridges that look down on Chinese positions. Once again, no guns are used. Instead, you have soldiers throwing rocks, swinging clubs, pushing and shoving just feet away from deadly drops. Each side accused the other of crossing the line. Each side built up its forces. By 2021, both nations had moved over 50,000 troops to the border, along with tanks, artillery, and aircraft, all while their soldiers continued to fight with sticks and stones. They've basically turned one of the highest borders in the world into a medieval battlefield with modern characteristics. But why are two nuclear powers fighting over what looks like empty mountain terrain? Why risk soldiers' lives for seemingly worthless, frozen peaks? The answer lies in strategy and symbolism, and it's more complex than you might think. For China, controlling these Himalayan heights isn't just about the territory itself. It's about protecting Tibet, which they see as their vulnerable underbelly. Since the 1959 Tibetan uprising and the Dalai Lama's escape to India, Chinese leaders have been paranoid about anyone threatening their control over Tibet. Every mountain peak, every valley that overlooks Tibet becomes critically important. But it's more than that. See these routes here? These are part of China's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. Their plan to build transportation networks across Asia. Many of these routes pass through Pakistan, India's arch rival and China's closest ally in the region. By controlling the high ground in the Himalayas, China can protect these investments and maintain pressure on India from multiple directions. For India, the stakes are even higher. Look at this narrow strip of land right here. It's called the Siliguri Corridor, but Indian military planners call it the Chicken's Neck. It's a vulnerable 14-mile wide corridor that connects India's northeastern states to the rest of the country. If China were to cut this corridor in a conflict, which they could do from positions they're fighting over, they could effectively cut off 45 million Indians from the rest of their country. And also, the memory of that 1962 humiliation is still fresh. For them, every inch of territory is sacred. Backing down is a matter of national pride. So now you've got two armies that combined spend over $300 billion a year on defense. Between them, they've got nearly 3 million active duty troops, thousands of tanks, hundreds of nuclear weapons. This is some of the most sophisticated military equipment humans have ever created. And yet, this is what combat actually looks like up there. Soldiers picking up rocks from the ground, troops fashioning clubs out of whatever wood they can find, warriors in modern combat helmets, wearing expensive body armor, swinging sticks at each other like it's the Middle Ages. If it weren't for the footage, you'd think I was joking. What do you think, who's right and who's wrong here? How could this conflict find an end? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and if you have a moment, check out another video here. We promise it'll be worth your time.